The
Hold
wind
still,
in
I need to bind
Nebraska
this
that
wound.
November
It
didn't
hurts
just
bad, but
blow.
thank you.
It
You're losing
screamed
too
like
much
a
blood.
wounded
Stay with
animal,
me.
a sound the
Bandits
locals
jumpy,
called
didn't see 'em
the
coming.
devil's
Rest
breath.
now. We'll get help.
It was a
Obliged, ma'am.
cold so
I owe
profound
you.
it felt as though the very air were turning into glass, ready to shatter against anything brave enough to stand in its path. When the iron wheels of the Pacific Express finally shrieked to a halt at the isolated siding of Blackwood Station, the sound was almost a relief compared to the oppressive silence of the surrounding prairie. Eliza Moore stepped down from the passenger car, her boots hitting the frost-covered wood of the platform with a hollow thud that echoed like a heartbeat in a tomb. She was 24 years old, and in her small, gloved hands, she carried the remains of a life that had once been filled with silk, poetry, and the soft glow of Boston chandeliers. Now, all she had left was a single, battered trunk and a letter from a man she had never met, promising her a life that sounded more like an escape than a dream. To the casual observer, if there had been any in that desolate place, Eliza looked like just another desperate soul, a mail-order bride sold by her circumstances to the highest bidder. Her coat was thin, its fur collar balding at the edges, and her face was pale from weeks of travel and the gnawing hunger she had learned to hide behind a mask of stoic dignity. Her father, a once respected merchant, had died in a debtor's prison, leaving Eliza with nothing but his name and a mountain of shame. She had watched as her high society friends turned their backs, their whispers following her down the cobbled streets of Boston like a trail of cold slime. A pity, they had said, but what can one expect from a woman with no dowry and a father with no honor? They had judged her by the balance in her bank account, stripping her of her personhood before she had even left the city limits. Standing on the platform, the steam from the locomotive swirling around her like a ghostly shroud, Eliza felt the weight of that judgment again. The station agent, a man named Silas with a face like a dried-out root and eyes that glittered with a mean, yellow light, leaned against the ticket window. He didn't offer to help with her trunk. Instead, he spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the frost near her feet and let out a short, barking laugh. "You must be the Brennan girl," Silas wheezed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Marcus Brennan doesn't like to wait, lady. He was here 2 hours ago, saw the train was late, and rode off. Said he didn't have time to waste on tardy cargo. He'll be back in a few days, maybe. If the snow doesn't block the pass. Until then, you're just another piece of unclaimed baggage clogging up my platform." Eliza didn't flinch. She had learned in the hard schools of Boston that showing fear to a bully was like bleeding in front of a shark. "I am not cargo, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the sharp edge of a blade. "And I am perfectly capable of waiting without your commentary. Is there somewhere I can sit out of this wind?" Silas chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "The waiting room is for paying passengers. You've already arrived. You're just a loiterer now. You can sit on your trunk and pray the wolves don't smell you before Marcus does. Or you can head down to the livery and see if they'll let you sleep in the hay with the rest of the animals. Seems a fit place for a woman who has to sell herself to a rancher just to get a meal." The cruelty of his words hit her harder than the wind. He saw her as low status, a woman with no protection, no money, and therefore, no right to respect. He felt empowered by her perceived weakness, using his tiny bit of authority to crush whatever spirit she had left. But Eliza simply turned her back on him, her eyes scanning the horizon for a light, a house, anything that suggested she wasn't completely alone in this frozen wilderness. That was when she heard it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creaking of the station signs. It was a low, agonizing groan that seemed to come from the very shadows beneath the station's overhanging roof. At the far end of the platform, where the light of the flickering oil lamps didn't reach, a heap of rags and shadow lay slumped against a stack of rotting crates. "Don't you go near that," Silas called out, his voice turning sharp. "That's just a drifter. A homeless bum who crawled in here last night. Probably got the lung fever or took a knife in a card game. I've been waiting for him to stop breathing so I can dump him in the ravine. Don't go getting your fancy skirts dirty on trash like that. He's a nobody. A zero. Not worth the dirt it'll take to bury him." Eliza felt a surge of cold fury that warmed her more than any fire could. "Ain't nobody," she whispered to herself. She stepped off the platform boards and into the mud and slush, walking toward the shadows. As she got closer, the smell hit her, iron-rich blood, stale sweat, and the unmistakable scent of impending death. She knelt down, the freezing mud soaking into her dress, and reached out a hand. The man was dressed in a tattered duster that had once been high-quality leather, but was now stained and torn. His boots were worn through at the soles, and a wide-brimmed hat lay crushed beside him. When Eliza gently lifted his head, she saw a man who looked like he had been through a war. His face was a map of scars and exhaustion, his jaw covered in a thick, dark beard matted with blood. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, but his eyes, when they fluttered open, were ancient. They were a piercing, crystalline blue, even through the haze of pain. "Water," he rasped, his voice a mere vibration in his throat. "I have you," Eliza said, her voice steadying as her purpose clarified. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small flask of water she had saved from the train. She supported his head, feeling the heat of a fierce fever radiating from his skin. As she let a few drops trickle into his mouth, he coughed, and fresh blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. She saw it then, a deep, jagged wound in his side, clumsily bandaged with a piece of dirty burlap. "Get away from him," I said. Silas was shouting now, stomping down the platform. "I won't have a mail-order slut bringing the plague into my station. He's a vagrant. He's got no money, no name, and no business dying on my property." Eliza stood up, her small frame silhouetted against the rising moon. She stood between the dying man and the station agent, her eyes burning with a fire that made the older man stop in his tracks. "His name is, human being," Eliza said, her voice trembling with indignation. "And as for business, my business is ensuring he doesn't die while a coward like you watches and laughs. This man is hurt. He's been shot. He needs a doctor, and he needs it now." Silas spat again, his face twisting into a sneer. "A doctor? For a homeless cowboy? The nearest doctor is 6 miles away at the Whitmore Ranch, and he doesn't ride out for trash. You want to save him? You carry him. Otherwise, get back to your trunk and shut your mouth before I decide to kick you off this property too." Eliza looked down at the man. He was large, easily twice her weight, and the darkness was closing in. The wind was picking up, threatening to turn the slush into solid ice. She had every reason to walk away. She was a woman alone in a dangerous land, waiting for a husband who already viewed her as cargo. If she missed Brennan, she would be truly homeless. If she stayed with this nobody, she was risking her reputation, her safety, and her very life. But then, the man's hand reached out. It was a rough hand, calloused from years of hard labor, and it gripped her wrist with a sudden, desperate strength. His blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting second, the delirium cleared. He didn't look like a drifter. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the world and was looking for one reason to believe there was still light at the top. "Don't let them," he whispered, his grip tightening. "I won't," Eliza promised, and in that moment, she wasn't the disgraced socialite or the desperate bride. She was a woman who had found her power in the act of mercy. She looked back at Silas, her expression one of utter contempt. "You think you're better than him because you have a roof and a badge? You're nothing but a ghost in a uniform, Silas. This man has more life in his dying breath than you've had in your entire miserable existence." She turned back to the man, her mind racing. 6 miles. 6 miles of frozen prairie, through a storm that was fast becoming a blizzard. She had no horse, no wagon, and no help. But she had a trunk with wheels, a length of rope she'd seen in the livery, and a heart that had been forged in the fires of Boston's betrayal. She was going to drag this dying cowboy through the gates of hell if she had to, because she knew what it felt like to be underestimated, and she was done letting the world decide who was worth saving. "You're coming with me," she whispered to the unconscious man, "and God help anyone who tries to stop us." The mystery of who this homeless man truly was, and the dark secret behind his wounds, was about to collide with Eliza's destiny in a way that would shake the foundations of the entire territory, proving that sometimes, the most important people are the ones the world tries its hardest to forget. When you complete the main data of the story, then add the ending line, "It's easy for me to copy the text and make voices." The blizzard didn't just howl, it hunted. It was a predatory wind that searched for any gap in a person's clothing, any weakness in their spirit, and filled it with the numbing promise of death. Silas, the station agent, stood safely within the threshold of his office, the warm, amber glow of a kerosene lamp framing his mocking silhouette. He watched through the glass as Eliza Moore, the woman he had branded as useless cargo, knelt in the freezing slush. "You're a fool, girl," Silas barked, his voice muffled by the thick timber of the door. "That man is dead weight, and you're nothing but a Boston porcelain doll about to shatter. Let the prairie have him. It's the only mercy a drifter deserves." Eliza didn't look back. Her world had narrowed down to the sound of the man's shallow, rattling breath and the agonizing burn in her own lungs. She had found an old, rusted luggage trolley behind the station, its iron wheels seized by years of neglect. With fingers that felt like brittle glass, she used her mother's heavy wool shawl and a length of coarse hemp rope to lash the unconscious cowboy to the frame. Her refined upbringing had taught her how to play the piano and recite Keats, but the brutal collapse of her family's fortune had taught her something far more valuable: how to endure when the world turned its back. "I am not a doll, Silas," she whispered into the wind, her voice lost to the gale. "And you are about to learn that the people you look down upon are the only ones who know how to stand." With a primal scream of effort, she heaved against the trolley. The iron wheels shrieked in protest, grinding against the frozen wood of the platform before finally, agonizingly, they began to turn. She stepped off the edge of the station's protection and into the white abyss of the Nebraska night. Every step was a battle against gravity and the elements. The mud of the trail was turning into a treacherous, icy sludge that threatened to pull her boots from her feet. The man, this nobody whom Silas wanted to dump in a ravine, groaned as the trolley jolted over a frozen rut. Eliza stopped, her chest heaving, and adjusted the makeshift bandage on his side. The blood was still seeping through, a dark, hot contrast to the white snow. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I didn't carry your secrets this far just to let you slip away." As she pushed deeper into the darkness, the silence of the prairie began to speak. It whispered of the wolves that followed the scent of blood and the men who used the cover of storms to hide their crimes. Halfway through the second mile, Eliza saw a flicker of light behind her, not the steady glow of the station, but the bouncing, erratic rhythm of a rider. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was it Marcus Brennan, coming to claim his property? Or was it someone even more dangerous? She pushed harder, the muscles in her back feeling as though they were being torn from the bone. She thought of her father, how he had died in a cold cell because he couldn't pay his debts to men who had once called him a friend. She thought of the way the high society ladies had looked at her with pity that felt like poison. They had underestimated her then, just as Silas and Brennan underestimated her now. They saw a woman of low status, a victim of circumstance, but Eliza knew the truth. She was the storm. Suddenly, the trolley hit a deep patch of snow and tipped. The man slid toward the edge, his head lolling. Eliza threw her body against the frame to steady it, her hands slipping on the ice. In the struggle, the man's coat fell open, and something caught the faint moonlight, a heavy gold medallion tucked into an inner pocket, engraved with a crest she recognized from her father's ledgers. It wasn't the mark of a drifter. It was the seal of the territorial governor's inner circle. The homeless man she was dragging through a blizzard was a high-ranking official, perhaps the only man with the power to expose the corruption that had ruined her father and was now poisoning this territory. The instant karma of Silas's cruelty began to loom large in her mind. When the truth came out, the man who had spat on a dying dog would realize he had been stepping on the throat of the law itself. But she had no time to celebrate. The rider was closing in. The sound of hoofbeats muffled by the snow grew louder, and a voice called out through the whiteout conditions, a voice she recognized as Marcus Brennan's. "Eliza! Stop this madness. You're dragging a corpse through the mud. Come back to the carriage, and I might still find a place for you in my kitchen." Eliza gripped the handle of the trolley, her knuckles white. She looked at the dying man, then back at the approaching shadow of the man who thought he owned her. The choice was clear. She wasn't just saving a stranger, she was hauling justice itself toward the finish line. "You'll have to catch me first, Marcus," she hissed, and with a strength born of pure defiance, she disappeared into the thickest part of the woods, the lights of the Whitmore ranch still miles away, but the fire in her heart burning brighter than any sun. When you complete the main data of the story, then add the ending line, "It's easy for me to copy the text and make voices." The gates of the Whitmore ranch loomed out of the swirling white chaos like the jagged teeth of a titan. They were massive, constructed of ancient oak and reinforced with iron, a fortress designed to keep the wild world out. For Eliza Moore, they represented the final boundary between life and a frozen grave. Her breath was a ragged, agonizing sob that burned her throat, and her hands had long since lost all feeling, frozen to the iron handle of the luggage trolley as if they were part of the machine itself. Behind her, through the curtain of snow, she could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of Marcus Brennan's horse. He was closing the distance. He was coming to reclaim what he called his cargo, and the thought of falling back into his hands gave Eliza a final, desperate burst of adrenaline. "Help!" she screamed, her voice cracking and thin against the roar of the gale. "Open the gates. Please, he's dying." Above the gates, on a sheltered stone walkway, a lantern flickered to life. Two men appeared, their silhouettes grim and imposing against the dark sky. One of them, a grizzled ranch hand named Thomas who had spent 30 years guarding the Whitmore interests, looked down at the pathetic sight below. He saw a woman in a shredded, mud-caked dress, her hair a wild nest of ice and dirt, heaving a rusted trolley that carried a heap of bloody rags. To him, she was nothing more than a low-status vagrant, a beggar seeking shelter in a storm that only the strong survived. "Move along, girl," Thomas bellowed, his voice booming over the wind. "This is the Whitmore Ranch, not a halfway house for every tramp and drifter in the territory. We don't take in your kind, and we certainly don't want whatever plague-ridden corpse you've got on that cart. Head back to the station before I set the dogs on you." The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. Eliza had traveled 2,000 miles, survived a betrayal that had left her penniless, and dragged a grown man through a blizzard, only to be told she wasn't the right kind to be saved. The sting of social prejudice was sharper than the frostbite. "He is not a corpse," Eliza shrieked, her eyes blazing with a primal fury that made Thomas pause. "He is a human being. And if you don't open these gates, his blood will be on your soul forever. Have you no mercy? Have you no shame?" Just then, Marcus Brennan's horse skidded into the circle of light cast by the perimeter lanterns. Brennan looked every bit the powerful aristocrat, his heavy fur cloak billowing like wings as he dismounted with practiced grace. He looked at Eliza with a sneer of triumph. "Thomas." "It's me, Brennan," he called out, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Don't mind the girl. She's my runaway mail-order bride. She's had a mental break, stolen that trolley from the station, and dragged a dead vagrant along to spite me. Open up, and I'll take her off your hands. I'll see she's disciplined properly for this embarrassment." Thomas nodded, reaching for the heavy iron lever. "Right away, Mr. Brennan. Sorry you had to chase your property onto our land. We'll help you load her into your carriage." "No." Eliza lunged forward, grabbing a lantern from the gatepost with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She thrust the light directly toward the face of the man on the trolley, shielding him from the wind with her own body. "Look at him. Before you hand me over to a monster, look at the man I saved. Look at his face, Thomas." Thomas paused, a frown deepening the lines on his face. Something in the girl's voice, a note of absolute, unwavering authority, stopped him. He held his own lantern out over the edge of the wall, the yellow light cutting through the snow to reveal the blood-stained features of the homeless man. The silence that followed was more deafening than the storm. Thomas's rifle, which had been resting against the stone, hit the wooden floor with a dull thud. His jaw dropped, and his face went as white as the snow. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not a drifter. That's Mr. Whitmore. That's Daniel." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. The low-status woman who had been mocked and dismissed was suddenly the most important person in the county. She was the only reason the king of the valley was still breathing. Thomas scrambled down the ladder, his boots slipping in his haste. "Get the gates open. Now. Get the doctor. Miguel, get the stretcher. Move, you fools, move." As the massive gates swung open, Brennan stepped forward, his face a mask of panic. "Wait. You can't believe her. It's a trick. She probably shot him herself." Thomas turned on Brennan, his hand resting on his sidearm, his eyes cold with a new understanding. "If you take one more step toward this woman, Marcus, I'll bury you under this snow myself. This tramp just saved the life of the man who owns your mortgage. You're lucky I don't pull this trigger right now for the lies you just told. Get off this land. Now." As the ranch hands rushed forward to lift Daniel Whitmore, Eliza felt the strength finally drain from her marrow. She collapsed into the slush, her hands still stained with the blood of the man she had refused to abandon. She had been underestimated, mocked, and hunted, but as the warmth of the ranch house spilled out into the yard, she knew the hierarchy of this land had been shattered forever. The mail-order bride had arrived as a beggar, but she would stand as a legend. When you complete the main data of the story then add the ending line, "It's easy for me to copy the text and make voices." The interior of the Whitmore Manor was a cathedral of cedar and stone, filled with the scent of beeswax and expensive tobacco, a world away from the frozen death Eliza had just escaped. But as she stood in the grand foyer, the blood on her tattered dress dripping onto a hand-woven Persian rug, she realized that the warmth of a fire didn't always mean a warm welcome. Martha, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face was as stiffly starched as her apron, approached Eliza with a silver tray that she held like a shield. She looked at Eliza's frostbitten cheeks and her mud-caked boots with a disgust so profound it was as if a stray dog had wandered into a palace. "The master's bedroom is no place for a girl of your station," Martha said, her voice dripping with ice. "You've done your bit, whatever that was. Thomas should have left you in the bunkhouse with the other laborers. You're getting filth on the floorboards that took 3 men a week to polish. Take your rags and go to the kitchen, the cook might have some leftover broth if you're quick about it." Eliza felt a flicker of the old Boston fire in her chest. She had survived a blizzard and saved the man who signed this woman's paychecks, yet she was still being measured by the dirt on her hem. "I am not going to the kitchen, Martha," Eliza said, her voice low and dangerous. "I am going to wait right here until the doctor tells me Daniel is breathing on his own. And as for your floors, I've spent the last 6 miles walking through blood and ice to bring your master home. I think the wood can handle a little mud." Before Martha could summon a retort, a man with a frantic expression and a black leather bag rushed down the stairs. It was Dr. Eris, the only surgeon within 50 miles. He was wiping his hands on a crimson-stained towel, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Who found him?" the doctor demanded, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "Who applied the tourniquet and the pressure dressing at the station?" Martha gestured vaguely toward Eliza, a smug look on her face. "This person, doctor. I'm sure she just made a mess of things. She's a mail-order girl Brennan rejected. Probably has no idea what she was doing." The doctor ignored Martha entirely. He stepped toward Eliza, his gaze intense. You did this? With what? I've never seen a field dressing so precise. You used a silk shawl and a silver hair comb to keep the arterial pressure stable. If that knot had been a fraction of an inch looser, he would have bled out before she reached the gate. You saved his life, girl. Not just his life, you saved his leg. How did you know how to do that? My father was a merchant, Eliza said quietly, her voice trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. But he spent his summers volunteering in the Boston infirmaries. He taught me that the difference between life and death is often just a matter of how much you're willing to sweat for a stranger. The instant karma hit Martha like a physical weight. The woman she had just insulted as a stray dog was now being heralded as a medical prodigy by the most respected man in the territory. Martha's face turned a deep shade of purple as she took a step back, her silver tray rattling in her hands. But the peace was short-lived. A thunderous pounding erupted at the front door. Thomas, the grizzled ranch hand, opened it to reveal a man in a sharp black suit and a top hat, flanked by 2 armed deputies. It was Mr. Finch, Marcus Brennan's legal counsel. He held a scrolled parchment as if it were a weapon of war. I am here for the woman known as Eliza Moore, Finch declared, his voice high and nasal. I have here a signed contract and a bill of sale. She is the legal property of the Brennan estate until her father's debts are settled in labor or marriage. Marcus Brennan demands his property be returned immediately, or we shall charge the Whitmore Ranch with grand larceny and the harboring of a fugitive. Thomas reached for his holster, his eyes narrowing. You've got a lot of nerve coming here after what your boss did to Mr. Whitmore. The law doesn't care about your grudges, Thomas, Finch sneered. He looked over Thomas's shoulder at Eliza, a predatory smile on his lips. Come now, Eliza. You're a low-born girl with a disgraced name. You have no status here. You're a guest of charity at best, and a thief at worst. Don't make this difficult. You belong to Mr. Brennan. Eliza stepped forward, her heart pounding. She looked at the doctor, then at the staircase where Daniel Whitmore lay fighting for his life. She was a woman of no means, a mail-order commodity in the eyes of the law. But then, a voice came from the top of the stairs, weak, rasping, but filled with a power that made even Finch flinch. It was Daniel. He was propped up against the railing, his face pale as a ghost, but his eyes were like blue fire. She belongs to no one, he gasped, each word a visible struggle. He looked down at the lawyer, a grim smile touching his lips. Tell Brennan that Eliza Moore is under the protection of the Whitmore seal. And as for her father's debt, I bought it from the Union Bank an hour before I went to the station. I own the notes, Finch. Which means I own the Brennan estate's mortgage. Tell your master that if he wants his property back, he'll have to pay me the $3 million his family owes my firm. Otherwise, he can start packing his bags. The silence in the room was absolute. That nobody Eliza had saved wasn't just a rancher, he was the primary financier for the entire territory. The low-status bride was now the protected ward of the most powerful man in the West. Finch's face went white. He dropped the scroll, his hand shaking as he touched his hat. Without a word, he turned and fled back into the storm, his deputies following close behind. Eliza looked up at Daniel. He gave a small, weary nod before the doctor ushered him back into the room. She was free. Truly free. But as she looked at the blood on her hands, she knew the war with Brennan was far from over. When you complete the main data of the story then add the ending line, it's easy for me to copy the text and make voices. The defeat in the foyer had stripped Marcus Brennan of his legal mask, leaving behind nothing but a raw, festering malice. He knew that once Daniel Whitmore fully recovered, the financial noose would tighten until the Brennan name was erased from the ledger of history. Desperation is a dangerous fuel, and that night, Brennan decided that if he could not own the valley, he would turn it into a graveyard. While the ranch slept, cloaked in the deceptive silence of the fading storm, Brennan's hired shadows, men who traded their souls for silver, crept onto the Whitmore land. Their target wasn't the master in his bed, but the lifeline of the ranch, the great timber barns and the central grain silos. They calculated that without their winter stores, the Whitmore cattle would perish, and the ranch would crumble by spring. Eliza Moore, however, had long ago lost the luxury of deep sleep. Years of listening for her father's creditors at the door had tuned her ears to the subtlest shift in the night. As she sat by the dying embers of the parlor fire, she heard it, not the wind, but the rhythmic, metallic clinking of a lantern latch and the heavy, muffled scent of kerosene drifting on the draft. She didn't scream for the ranch hands. She knew they were stationed at the front gates, lured away by a decoy fire Brennan had set on the far ridge. They had underestimated her once again, thinking a city girl would be cowering under her blankets. With a silent, predatory grace, Eliza grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and slipped out the side servant's entrance. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she welcomed it. It sharpened her focus. She saw 3 men near the main barn, their silhouettes jagged against the snow as they prepared to strike a match that would incinerate the ranch's future. These were men who viewed women as ornaments or obstacles, and as they saw a lone female figure approaching through the gloom, they didn't reach for their guns. They laughed. "Look at this," one of the thugs sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Brennan said there was a little bird nesting here. You lost, sweetheart. Or did you come out to keep us warm before the big fire starts?" He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to mockingly pat her cheek. He saw a mail-order bride, a girl of low status, who should have been trembling. He didn't see the woman who had dragged a dying man 6 miles through a blizzard. In one fluid motion, Eliza swung the iron poker. It didn't strike his hand, it shattered the kerosene jar he was holding. The glass exploded, drenching the thug in the flammable liquid. Before he could scream, Eliza stepped into his space, her eyes cold as the Nebraska ice. "You came to burn a home," she whispered, her voice a terrifying calm. "But you forgot that some people are made of the very fire you're trying to start." She didn't need to strike a match. The thug, terrified by the sudden realization that this helpless girl was ready to take him down with her, tripped backward into his own lantern. The instant karma was blinding. A small, controlled burst of flame ignited his boots, sending him howling into the snowbank to extinguish himself. The other 2 men, stunned by the sheer ferocity of her counterattack, hesitated. That hesitation was their undoing. The ranch hands, alerted by the commotion and Eliza's brilliant use of the decoy fire's own logic against them, swarmed from the shadows. Thomas was the first to reach her, his rifle leveled at the remaining saboteurs. He looked at the shattered glass, the drenched thug, and the iron poker in Eliza's hand. The respect in his eyes was no longer just for her act of mercy at the gate, it was for her soul. "You took them on alone," Thomas breathed, a look of awe crossing his rugged face. "You didn't even wait for us." "They thought I was just a bride," Eliza said, her breath hitching as the adrenaline began to fade. "They thought because I was bought and sold, I didn't know how to fight for what's mine. They were wrong." By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the 3 saboteurs were bound in the cellar, and Marcus Brennan's final gamble had collapsed. He had tried to use Eliza's low status as a weapon, believing her to be the weakest link in the Whitmore chain. Instead, he had found the very steel that held the ranch together. Daniel Whitmore, watching from his window as the men were led away, knew that the woman who had saved his life had now saved his legacy. The mail-order bride was no longer a guest, she was the commander of the valley. Part 6, the gavel of truth and the crown of honor. The town of Blackwood had never seen a crowd so thick or attention so suffocating. The local courthouse, a drafty building of unpainted pine, was packed to the rafters with people who had come to witness what they believed would be the final shaming of Eliza Moore. Marcus Brennan had spent the week spreading poison, painting Eliza not as a savior, but as a predatory opportunist who had manipulated a dying man to steal his fortune. To the townspeople, the shopkeepers, the farmers, and the gossips, Eliza was still the low-status, mail-order bride who didn't know her place. They whispered behind their hands as she entered the room, her back straight, wearing a simple but elegant charcoal dress that Martha, now her fiercest ally, had stayed up all night tailoring. Marcus Brennan sat at the front, flanked by 3 high-priced lawyers from the city. He looked like a king in exile, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, vengeful light. He believed that even if he couldn't have the ranch, he could still destroy the woman who had humiliated him. The judge, a man named Henderson who was known for his rigid adherence to tradition and his skepticism of outsiders, banged his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. This hearing is to determine the legal status of the contracts held by the Brennan estate, Judge Henderson droned, peering over his spectacles at Eliza. And to address the charges of kidnapping and fraud brought against Miss Eliza Moore. Brennan's lead lawyer stood up, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. Your Honor, we intend to prove that Miss Moore used her father's debts to gain entry into this territory, then systematically exploited a wounded Daniel Whitmore to secure a position of power she has neither earned nor deserves. She is a woman of no means, a mail-order commodity who has overstepped the bounds of decency. The crowd murmured in agreement. In their eyes, status was a birthright, and Eliza was an interloper. For an hour, they grilled her. They asked about her father's bankruptcy, the shame of her journey, and her improper presence in the Whitmore manor. Eliza stood in the witness box, a lone figure of grace against a sea of judgment. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. She waited for the moment when the world's smallness would meet its match. That moment arrived with the sound of a heavy cane striking the floorboards at the back of the room. The doors swung open, and Daniel Whitmore walked down the center aisle. He wasn't the nobody in rags from the station, nor the bedridden patient from the ranch. He was dressed in a suit of fine black wool, his silver-topped cane a symbol of authority rather than weakness. The room went silent. The King of the Valley had arrived. I believe you're looking for a witness, Daniel said, his voice resonant and clear, cutting through the stagnant air of the courtroom. He didn't go to the front, he walked straight to the witness box and stood beside Eliza, placing a protective hand over hers. Mr. Whitmore, the judge stammered, his posture straightening instantly. You should be resting. The doctor said. The doctor said I was dead when I arrived at the station, Daniel interrupted, his gaze fixing on Marcus Brennan with the intensity of a predator. And I would be, if not for the woman you are currently trying to crucify. You speak of status and decency. Marcus Brennan left me to rot in the mud because I stood in the way of his greed. He judged me as trash when I was down, and he judges Eliza as lowly because she has the courage he lacks. Daniel pulled a sheaf of documents from his coat. These aren't just property deeds, Your Honor. These are the records I retrieved from the Union Bank. They prove that the debts Marcus Brennan used to enslave Eliza's father were fraudulent, manufactured through a series of illegal land grabs and forged signatures. My father didn't just sabotage the Moore family, he stole their legacy. The instant karma was a physical force in the room. Brennan's face went from smug to a sickly, pale gray. The lawyers beside him began to shuffle their papers, realizing the ship was sinking. But Daniel wasn't finished. You call her a mail-order bride? Daniel addressed the entire room now, his voice rising. I call her the savior of Blackwood. And because this territory values status so much, let me make this official. As of this morning, Eliza Moore is the executive trustee of the Whitmore Holdings. She is the most powerful financial voice in this county. If any of you wish to keep your lines of credit, or if you, Judge Henderson, wish to see the new courthouse funded, you will address her with the respect she has more than earned. The silence that followed was absolute. That nobody had been revealed as a queen, and the high-status villain was now a common criminal. Brennan tried to stand, to shout, to lie one last time, but the marshals were already moving toward him. He had tried to use the law to crush a lowly woman, and instead, the law had become his cage. As the judge dismissed the charges and the crowd began to scramble for Eliza's favor, she looked at Daniel. She didn't need the money or the title, she needed the truth. And in the eyes of the man who had seen her soul when she was covered in mud, she found it. The dust of the courtroom trial had barely settled before Eliza Moore began to remodel the world that had once tried to discard her. The low status label that had been pinned to her like a badge of shame during her journey across the country had been stripped away, replaced by the heavy mantle of executive trustee of the Whitmore Holdings. But Eliza didn't use her newfound power to seek petty revenge, she used it to seek a restoration of dignity for those the world had forgotten. Her first act was to return to the Blackwood station, the place where her nightmare had begun. Silas, the station agent who had laughed at her while Daniel lay dying in the shadows, was no longer the arrogant king of his wooden platform. When he saw the polished Whitmore carriage pull up, and Eliza stepping out dressed in charcoal velvet with the authority of a governor, he didn't spit. He trembled. He dropped his tobacco tin, his knees knocking as he realized that the unclaimed baggage he had insulted now owned the very building he stood in. Eliza walked up to the ticket window, her gaze cool and unwavering. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she placed a legal document on the counter. "I've bought the station, Silas," she said, her voice like silk over stone. "And I've bought the livery and the telegraph line. You told me I was trash, not worth the dirt to bury me. You watched a man bleed because you didn't think he had enough status to deserve a doctor." Silas began to stammer an apology, his face a mask of sweating terror, but Eliza raised a hand. "I'm not firing you, Silas. I'm giving you a choice. You will work as a porter. You will carry every bag, help every traveler, and treat every nobody who steps off that train like a member of the royal family. Or, you can walk into that blizzard with nothing but the clothes on your back, just like you expected Daniel to do. Which will it be?" The instant karma was visible in the way Silas bowed his head, his pride shattered by the very mercy he had refused to give. He was now the servant of the woman he had tried to crush. But while the town was transforming, the shadows of the old regime were still lurking in the hills. Marcus Brennan was behind bars, but his private militia, a group of cutthroats led by a man known only as Iron Jack, felt they were still owed for the dirty work they had done. They didn't care about legal titles or bank notes, they only understood the language of fire and lead. They had occupied the construction site of the new medical clinic Eliza was building, a project meant to ensure that no one in the valley would ever be left to suffer again. They held the workers hostage, demanding a ransom that would drain the ranch's liquid assets. They thought they were dealing with a city girl who would be easily intimidated by a display of brute force and jagged steel. When the news reached the ranch, Thomas and the men reached for their rifles, their faces grim with the expectation of a bloodbath. But Eliza stopped them. "Violence is what they expect," she said, her mind working with the cold precision that had kept her alive in the slums of Boston. "They want a war because they think they can win it. I'm going to give them a bankruptcy instead." She spent the next 3 hours with the ranch's ledger and a telegraph operator. She didn't ride to the clinic with an army, she rode with a briefcase and 2 marshals. She knew that the most effective way to deal with a bully wasn't to hit him, but to take away the ground he stood on. Eliza arrived at the clinic site just as Iron Jack was preparing to set fire to the scaffolding. He was a massive man with a jagged scar across his throat, his hand resting on the butt of a heavy revolver. "You're a long way from the parlor, little lady," he sneered, his men laughing behind him. "Brennan's gone, but we still run this valley. Hand over the gold, or we'll turn this Mercy House into a funeral pyre." He looked at her with the same dismissive contempt she had seen in every man who thought status was measured by the size of a gun. He saw a mail-order bride playing at being a boss. Eliza didn't flinch. She stepped off her horse and walked right up to the line of armed men. "I'm not here to pay you, Jack," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I'm here to tell you that you're trespassing. And not just on my land. You see those horses you're riding? I bought the debt on the Brennan stables this afternoon. Those horses are legally mine. The guns in your holsters. Those were purchased on a line of credit from the Blackwood General Store, which I now own. And the boots on your feet? They were made in a factory that I just acquired a controlling interest in." She pulled out a stack of legal notices, her eyes flashing with a fierce, quiet intelligence. "As of 10 minutes ago, every one of you is in default. The marshals are here to repossess my property. You can leave now, on foot and unarmed, or you can go to prison as common thieves. The lowly bride is giving you a chance to walk away. I suggest you take it before the high-status law catches up with you." The outlaws looked at each other, their bravado evaporating as they realized they were standing in a world where their weapons were useless against the financial and moral fortress Eliza had built. One by one, they dropped their gun belts into the dirt. They realized that the woman they had mocked had dismantled their entire lives with a pen before they could even draw a pistol. Iron Jack looked at Eliza, his face a mixture of rage and reluctant awe. He had never seen a woman stand so tall with so little fear. They turned and walked into the darkness, stripped of their power by the very person they had intended to rob. As the workers were freed and the townspeople gathered around, Eliza realized that respect wasn't something you bought, it was something you built, one act of courage at a time. The mail-order bride had not only saved a man, she had redefined the soul of a territory. The winter thaw had begun, turning the iron-hard ground of the Nebraska plains into a sea of fertile mud, but inside the Whitmore Library, the air remained thick with the scent of old paper and unresolved history. Eliza Moore, now the respected administrator of the estate, found herself drawn to a heavy mahogany desk that had belonged to Daniel's father, a man known as the Iron Founder of the Valley. While organizing the chaotic archives to settle the final tax liens against the Brennan estate, her hand brushed against a knot in the wood of the desk's secret compartment. With a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a tattered blue ribbon, letters that didn't bear the Whitmore seal, but the elegant, flowing script of her own father, Thomas Moore. As Eliza untied the ribbon, her heart hammered against her ribs. These were not mere business correspondences, they were desperate pleas dated 20 years ago. As she read, the low-status identity she had carried like a heavy yoke began to dissolve, replaced by a shocking truth that recontextualized her entire life. The letters revealed that her father hadn't just been a merchant in Boston, he had been the primary silent partner who funded the original Whitmore expansion. Daniel's father and hers had been best friends, bound by a pact to build a sanctuary in the West. But the letters also spoke of a third party, a man named Silas Brennan, Marcus's father, who had been entrusted with delivering the dividends of the ranch back to the Moore family in Boston. The instant karma of the situation was staggering. Marcus Brennan's father hadn't just been a rival, he had been a thief of the highest order. He had intercepted the wealth meant for the Moores, using it to build his own empire while leaving Eliza's father to descend into a poverty that eventually killed him. Every hardship Eliza had faced, the loss of her home, the shame of the debtor's prison, and the desperation that led her to become a mail-order bride, had been architected by the Brennan family. She wasn't an outsider who had lucked into a position of power, she was the rightful heir to the very foundation the valley was built upon. The woman the town had viewed as a beggar was, in fact, their silent benefactor's daughter. When Daniel entered the room, he found Eliza clutching the letters, tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. She handed him the documents without a word. As Daniel read the evidence of the Brennan betrayal, his face went from confusion to a deep, visceral shame. He looked at the woman who had dragged him through a blizzard to save his life, realizing that his own family's prosperity had been bought with her family's suffering. The hierarchy he had been born into was a lie, he was the one who owed everything to the mail-order girl. "Eliza," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he dropped the letters onto the desk. "All these years, I thought we built this from nothing. My father died thinking your father had abandoned the pact. Brennan, he didn't just steal your money. He stole 20 years of friendship and safety from us." He stepped toward her, not as a master or a protector, but with the profound humility of a man seeking penance. "This ranch, the land, the gold, it doesn't belong to the Whitmores. It belongs to the Moores. I am not your benefactor, Eliza. I am your debtor." Eliza looked at him, and in that moment, the themes of resilience and kindness that had guided her through the dark came full circle. She didn't feel the urge to cast him out or reclaim the land with bitterness. Instead, she saw the instant karma not as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool for ultimate restoration. "We were both victims of a shadow, Daniel," she said, taking his hand. "My father didn't send me here to take this from you. He sent me here, through the grace of God and the cruelty of Brennan, to find what was lost. We aren't master and servant, or debtor and creditor. We are the legacy they tried to kill." The revelation sent shockwaves through the ranch. The staff, who had already begun to love Eliza for her strength, now looked at her with an awe that bordered on reverence. They realized that the lowly woman they had initially dismissed was the daughter of the man who had provided the very silver for their first wages. The social justice of the territory was finally being righted, not through a gavel, but through the undeniable weight of history. But as they stood together in the library, a new threat emerged. Marcus Brennan, hearing rumors of the discovery from his cell, had one final, desperate card to play, a legal loophole that threatened to invalidate all land deeds in the valley unless a Moore and a Whitmore were legally joined by the first of the month. The transition from winter to spring in Nebraska usually brought hope, but for the residents of the Whitmore Valley, the first thaw of April brought a chilling realization. Marcus Brennan, even from the cold confines of his jail cell, had managed to strike one final, venomous blow. His lawyers, led by the spindly and soulless Mr. Finch, had unearthed an ancient territorial charter, the Founders' Reversion Clause. The document stated that the original land grants for the entire valley were contingent upon the combined house of Moore and Whitmore. If a legal union between the two families was not recognized by the territorial court by the first of the month, the deeds would be declared null and void, and the land would revert to a territorial board, a board that Brennan had spent a decade filling with his own corrupt cronies. The town of Blackwood, which had only just begun to respect Eliza Moore, was suddenly plunged into a fever of panic. Farmers, shopkeepers, and ranch hands who had once looked down on Eliza as unclaimed baggage now crowded the gates of the Whitmore Ranch, their faces etched with desperation. They realized that their homes, their livelihoods, and their futures were held in the hands of the very woman they had mocked. The instant karma was palpable. The people who had treated Eliza like a commodity now realized she was the only shield standing between them and total ruin. They begged her to marry Daniel, to sign the contract, to save them, as if she were a tool meant for their convenience. Inside the manor, the tension was a living thing. Eliza sat in the library, the reversion clause spread out on the desk before her. She felt the old, familiar weight of being a piece on someone else's chessboard. In Boston, she had been sold to pay a debt. On the train, she had been a mail-order item. And now, the law was trying to force her into a marriage to save a town that had only offered her cruelty until they needed her strength. Daniel stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the setting sun. He had recovered his health, but his soul was burdened by the truth of the letters. "They're asking too much of you, Eliza," he said, his voice a low rumble of grief. "You've already given your blood and your sweat to this land. I won't have you forced into another contract. If the price of keeping this ranch is your freedom, then let the board take it. I'd rather be a pauper with a clear conscience than a king who bought a wife for a second time." Eliza looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt the power of a choice that wasn't born of desperation. She didn't see a master or a savior in Daniel, she saw a partner. She realized that respect wasn't just about how others saw you, but about how you stood for yourself. "If I marry you, Daniel, it won't be because a piece of paper tells me to," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "And it won't be to save a town that hasn't yet learned how to stand on its own. It will be because we are the only two people in this valley who know what it's like to be left for dead." But the path to the altar was not a peaceful one. Brennan, realizing that a marriage would seal his doom, sent word to his remaining loyalists, a group of desperate men who knew that if the land reverted, they could buy it for pennies. They didn't want a wedding, they wanted a funeral. On the morning of the final day, as Eliza and Daniel prepared to ride into town to meet the circuit judge, they found the main road blocked. A bridge had been sabotaged, and Brennan's men were stationed in the high brush, rifles glinting in the morning light. Thomas and the ranch hands reached for their weapons, ready for a bloody showdown, but Eliza stepped forward. She was wearing her riding habit, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant braid. She didn't look like a bride, she looked like a general. "They think we're going to fight our way through," she told the men. "They think they can stop a union by stopping a carriage. They're still looking at us like characters in a play. They don't realize that the Moore and Whitmore legacy doesn't live in a courthouse. It lives in the mud." Instead of the main road, Eliza led them through the treacherous Ghost Pass, the very trail she had dragged Daniel through during the blizzard. It was a narrow, rocky path that no sane person would take on horseback, but Eliza knew every inch of it. She led the column of riders with a fierce, quiet confidence, her resilience inspiring even the most hardened ranch hands. They bypassed the ambush entirely, appearing at the back of the town square just as the clock began to strike noon, the deadline for the reversion. The town square was packed. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, stood on the courthouse steps, a pocket watch in his hand and a smug smile on his face. He began to announce the seizure of the land, his voice echoing with the arrogance of a man who thought he had won. "As the clock strikes 12 and no union has been recorded, I hereby declare the Whitmore Valley the property of—" "You declare nothing, Mr. Finch." Eliza's voice cut through the air like a whip. She rode her horse straight to the steps, her clothes covered in the dust of the trail, but her eyes shining with the light of victory. She dismounted and walked up the steps, Daniel by her side. The circuit judge, a man who had seen the transformation of the territory, stepped forward. "Miss Moore, Mr. Whitmore, you are just in time. Do you come here of your own free will to seal the pact of the founders?" Eliza looked at the crowd, the people who had doubted her, the people who had judged her, and the people who now held their breath in hope. She didn't look at them with spite, she looked at them with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned her place at the table. "I come here to claim my heritage," she said. "And to build a future where the only thing that matters is the content of a person's character." As the judge spoke the words and the papers were signed, a roar went up from the crowd, not of greed, but of genuine relief and newfound respect. The instant karma for Brennan was complete. He had tried to use a legal loophole to steal the land, and instead, he had forced a union that made his enemies invincible. The mail-order bride and the dying cowboy had become the architects of a new era. But as the celebration began, Eliza noticed a stranger in the crowd, a man with a legal satchel who didn't look like a local. He approached her as she stepped off the porch, a look of profound apology on his face. "Mrs. Whitmore," he asked. "I am a representative from the Boston Probate Court. I've been looking for you for months. There's something you need to know about your father's debts in the East." The cheers of the town square still echoed in the distance as Eliza and Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, their hands intertwined, the ink on their marriage certificates still damp. It should have been the end of the struggle, a victory for the low-status bride and the dying cowboy. But as the stranger from Boston, Mr. Sterling, opened his leather satchel, a hush fell over the immediate circle. He pulled out a document embossed with the high seal of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sterling began, his voice soft but weighted with gravity, "you spent years believing your father died in shame, chased by creditors he couldn't pay. You believed Marcus Brennan held the keys to your life because of a debt your father owed him. But there is a final chapter your father wrote that was hidden until today." Eliza felt the world tilt. "What are you saying, Mr. Sterling?" "I watched the bailiffs take our furniture. I saw my father's spirit break." "He didn't break, Eliza," Sterling said, handing her a weathered, sealed envelope. "He made a gamble. He knew Silas Brennan was siphoning the funds from the West. He knew he couldn't beat them in Boston, where their influence was absolute. So, he took the last of his liquid assets, the money everyone thought he had gambled away, and placed it into a blind trust. A trust that was hidden under a false name, designed to accumulate interest for 20 years. It could only be unlocked by one person, his daughter, provided she was on Nebraska soil and had successfully reclaimed the Moore-Whitmore Pact. The instant karma was staggering. The debts that had forced Eliza to become a mail-order bride were a phantom, a lie Marcus Brennan had maintained to keep her under his control. In reality, Eliza was not just the co-owner of a ranch, she was the heiress to one of the largest private fortunes in the country. The woman who had arrived at the train station with $4 in her pocket was now, quite literally, the woman who owned the banks that held Marcus Brennan's chains. The revelation didn't just change her bank account, it changed the very soul of the valley. Eliza didn't use the wealth to buy a mansion in the East or to return to the high society that had shunned her. Instead, she performed an act of radical social justice that the territory would talk about for a century. She called a town hall meeting, not in the courthouse, but in the middle of the very field where Brennan's men had tried to burn the ranch. "You all looked at me and saw a girl with no name," Eliza told the gathered crowd, her voice amplified by the quiet respect of the people who now looked to her for leadership. "You saw a mail-order item. But my father didn't send me here to be a wife, he sent me here to be a witness. To see who you are when the sun is down and the wolves are howling." She looked at Silas the station agent, at the shopkeepers who had once refused her credit, and at the farmers who had once whispered about her status. "I am canceling the interest on every debt held by the Moore Whitmore Bank," she announced. The crowd gasped, a wave of shock rippling through the field. "But there is a condition. This valley will no longer be built on who has the most gold or who was born with the best name. We are building a community where a nobody at a train station gets the same care as a king in a manor. If you want to stay in this valley, you will earn your status through your kindness, not your contracts." The transformation was absolute. The instant karma for the town was a collective realization of their own smallness, replaced by a fierce pride in the new standard Eliza set. Marcus Brennan, from his prison cell, was forced to watch as the very woman he had tried to buy used her wealth to build a university and a state-of-the-art hospital that bore her father's name. He died in obscurity, his name a footnote in a history book that hailed Eliza Moore as the mother of the plains. In the final scene of their story, Eliza and Daniel stood on the porch of their home as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold. The ranch was no longer a fortress, it was a beacon. "You were right, Eliza," Daniel said, pulling her close. "My father and yours, they didn't just want to build a ranch. They wanted to build a place where a person's worth couldn't be measured by a ledger." Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the lights of the town she had saved. She had started her journey as a ghost of her former self, a woman underestimated by every person she met. She had ended it as the architect of a new world, proving that respect isn't a gift given by the powerful, it is a fire forged by those who refuse to stay in the shadows.